He told me he was going to Dallas for a conference. 3 days, he said. Maybe 4 if the workshops ran long. He kissed me on the cheek on a Tuesday morning, rolled his suitcase to the door, and said he'd call when he landed. I made coffee after he left. I stood at the kitchen window watching the neighbors' sprinklers go off across the street, the same way they did every Tuesday at 7:15. And I thought about how ordinary everything felt. How predictable. The sprinklers. The coffee. My husband leaving for work trips he'd been taking more and more often since the beginning of the year. I didn't think anything was wrong. That's the part that still catches me sometimes, even now. I didn't think anything was wrong. I work in forensic accounting. I've spent 6 years helping law firms and insurance companies find money that people have tried to hide. I know how to read a bank statement the way a doctor reads an X-ray. Not just the numbers, but the space between them. The timing. The pattern. The thing that almost looks right but isn't. I know all of this, and I still didn't see it coming. We'd been married for 7 years. I was 28 when we got together, 30 when we married. He was older, 36, a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical distribution company. He traveled. That was always part of it. Boston 1 week, Chicago the next. Sometimes the West Coast. I was used to the empty side of the bed. I was used to eating dinner alone on Wednesdays. I thought that was just what our life looked like, and I had made peace with it. The apartment we lived in was his before it was ours. A 2-bedroom on the 14th floor of a building in River North, Chicago. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a balcony I never used in winter, a kitchen he'd renovated the year before we got married. It was a beautiful apartment. I always felt slightly like a guest in it, even after 7 years. I don't know why I'm only now admitting that. He called Tuesday night. He sounded tired, which I expected. He said the first day of sessions had run long. The hotel restaurant was overpriced. He'd ordered room service instead. I told him about a problem I'd been working through at work. A discrepancy in a client's LLC transfers that wasn't adding up. He listened, or I thought he did. He said, "You always figure it out." And I felt a small warm thing in my chest. The way you do when someone says exactly the right thing at the right time. I went to sleep thinking everything was fine. Wednesday afternoon, my mother called. She lives in Cincinnati and she'd been planning to drive up to visit that weekend, but she wanted to check whether Friday or Saturday was better. I told her either worked. Then she asked, almost as an aside, whether my husband's conference was in Dallas or Houston because she thought she remembered me mentioning Houston. I said Dallas. She said, "Oh, I could have sworn you said Houston." Never mind, it doesn't matter. It didn't matter. Except that after we hung up, I sat at my desk with the phone still in my hand, and I thought I never mentioned Dallas to her. I hadn't talked to her since last week. I had told her my husband was traveling. I had not told her where, so either she'd confused it with a previous trip, he had gone to Houston in March, or she had heard it from someone else, and the only other person she talked to who knew my husband's schedule was my sister-in-law, his sister Maureen, who lived 20 minutes from my mother and had coffee with her sometimes. I texted Maureen that evening, casual, just to check in. We weren't close, but we were friendly. She responded quickly, asked how I was doing, said she hadn't heard from her brother in a few days. I asked if she knew where he was this week. She said she thought he was in Chicago. I read that 3 times. She thought he was in Chicago. I want to tell you that I immediately knew that the pieces clicked into place and I had clarity right away. That's not what happened. What happened was, I felt something go quiet inside me. The way a room goes quiet when someone says something no one knows how to respond to. I held breath. I held everything. I told myself there was probably an explanation. Maybe he'd changed plans and hadn't mentioned it. Maybe the conference had been relocated. Maybe Maureen had gotten confused. People mix things up. I mix things up, but I'm an accountant, and when a number doesn't match, you don't assume you misread it. You go back to the source. I opened our joint checking account on my laptop. He was still listed as a joint holder, though he'd started paying most of his travel expenses on a corporate card 2 years ago. Still, I looked. There was a charge. 2 nights ago, Monday. A hotel, the Kimpton Gray on West Monroe Street. In Chicago. Monday. A hotel. The Kimpton Gray on West Monroe Street. It was 38 minutes by taxi from our apartment. I sat with that for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere below, a car alarm went off and stopped. I looked at the charge again. $412. One night. Checked in Monday, which was the day before he supposedly flew to Dallas. He had not gone to Dallas. I opened the American Airlines app and logged into the household account we shared for Miles. You can look at recent searches. He had searched flights to Dallas the week before. I could see that. But the booking tab showed no recent purchases. No ticket. He had searched. He had not bought. He was in a hotel 6 miles from where I was sitting. I thought about calling him. I had this image in my mind of just dialing his number and saying, "I know where you are." The fantasy of it. The cleanness. But I've seen enough cases at work to know that the worst thing you can do with evidence is tip off the person who's hiding it. You move too soon, they move faster. You let them know what you know, and suddenly accounts get consolidated, assets get transferred, narratives get prepared. I didn't call him. Instead, I opened a spreadsheet. I know that sounds absurd. My husband might be lying about where he is, might be in a hotel room with someone else, and I opened a spreadsheet. But that is how my brain works. That is what I do when I'm trying not to panic. I put things in columns. I find what I can verify. I pulled up our joint credit card, the one we used for household expenses, and started going back 6 months. I wasn't looking for hotel charges specifically. I was looking for patterns, for anomalies, for the thing that almost looks right but isn't. I found it in February. There was a recurring charge I hadn't noticed. Small, $87 a month, hitting on the 3rd of every month, to a company listed as Meridian Home Services, LLC. I had assumed at some point that it was a subscription for something, the way you have a dozen subscriptions and stop tracking them individually. But I had never signed up for anything called Meridian Home Services. And when I searched for the company, I found it was registered in Illinois as a property management firm. A property management firm. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I was someone who cried at commercials, who got flustered when I had to dispute a charge with customer service. But right now, I was very, very steady. I texted a colleague, someone I trust, someone who does the same kind of work I do, and asked if she could help me look into an LLC registration quietly and quickly. She didn't ask questions. She pulled the registered agent information within an hour. Meridian Home Services, LLC, registered February of last year. The managing member listed on the filing was my husband, under his middle name, which he never used for anything else. The registered address was a unit in a building in the West Loop neighborhood. He had an apartment. He had an apartment that I did not know about, that he had been paying for with money from our joint account, disguised as a home services fee for over a year. I sat back in my chair and I looked out the window at the city. All those windows. All those lights. Somewhere out there my husband was in a hotel room on West Monroe Street, and in the West Loop there was an apartment with his name on it, and I had been sitting in our kitchen for 7 years thinking our life looked ordinary. I cried then. I want to be honest about that. I cried for about 20 minutes, alone in the kitchen, and it was not graceful or quiet. It was the kind of crying that surprises you with how much of it there is, how physical it is, how it comes from somewhere below your ribs. And then I stopped, and I opened a new document. I had work to do. Over the next 48 hours, I did not contact my husband except to send normal texts. "How's the conference? How are the sessions? Miss you." He responded the way he always did. Short, slightly distracted. "Fine, good, miss you too." He even sent me a photo at one point, just a street corner in Chicago. The kind of generic urban shot that could have been anywhere, but which I recognized from the angle as being 2 blocks from the Kimpton Gray. He was not even trying that hard. I got an appointment with a family law attorney on Thursday afternoon. My husband didn't know I had a lawyer friend from college who'd moved into divorce work. I called her directly, not through a referral. I sat in her office and I laid out what I had: the hotel charge, the LLC, the 12 months of payments, the registered address. She looked at the documents I'd printed, and she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "You have more than most people bring me." She told me about equitable distribution in Illinois, marital assets, non-marital assets, how hidden property factors in. She told me about the steps. She told me what not to do, which included confronting him before we had properly documented everything and before she had sent the discovery requests. I told her I understood. I mostly understood. There was a part of me, the part that had been married for 7 years, the part that had driven with this man to his mother's house every Thanksgiving, the part that had held his hand in the hospital when his father had a health scare 2 winters ago. That part wanted to call him and scream, wanted to know why, wanted him to have to look at me and explain how we went from that hospital waiting room to this. My attorney told me to hold that part down a little longer, so I did. She filed the discovery requests and served him the following Monday. He was home by then, had returned from his conference on Friday afternoon, kissed me on the cheek in exactly the same way he'd left and told me Dallas had been productive. I had said, "I'm glad." I had made dinner. I had watched television beside him on the couch. I want you to understand how strange that was. 7 years of closeness compressed into this awful performance, both of us on opposite sides of something he didn't know I could see. I watched him read on his phone. I watched him laugh at something. I thought, I don't know you. I'm not sure I ever did. When the process server appeared at his office Monday morning, I was at work. My phone buzzed. It was him. He called 3 times in 4 minutes. I let it go to voicemail. His message was 11 seconds long. His voice was very controlled, which told me everything. He said, "We need to talk. Call me back when you can." I finished my meeting. I called him back during my lunch break from a conference room with the door shut. He asked me if I'd hired an attorney. I said yes. He was quiet for a beat and then he said, "I want to explain." I said, "I know about the apartment." Longer silence. "I know about Meridian Home Services," I said. "I know about the 12 months of payments. I know about her." I didn't know about her specifically, not her name or her face, not yet, but I knew the shape of it. And I was right because he didn't deny it. He said, "This isn't what you think it is." They always say that. I had read enough depositions to know that when someone says this isn't what you think, they mean, please give me a moment to construct something more manageable than the truth. I said, "I think it's exactly what it is. My attorney will be in touch." I hung up. My hands were shaking when I put the phone down. The steadiness from that first night was gone. I was just a person in a glass conference room, 34 years old, having just ended a 7-year marriage in 11 words. The months that followed were not dramatic in the way you might expect. There was no screaming match. There was no moment of theatrical confrontation where he broke down and confessed everything with tears running down his face. What there was instead was paperwork. A lot of it. Discovery requests and financial disclosures and depositions and the long grinding work of untangling 2 people's finances from each other when one of them had been quietly moving money in directions he didn't want anyone to see. My professional background helped. My attorney said more than once that my clients are lucky to have you, and I said I'm not sure I'm lucky right now, but I'll take it. We found 3 accounts he hadn't disclosed. One of them had been opened 6 months into the affair, which, as it turned out, had been going on for 18 months, 2 full years before she had her own apartment key. The woman in question worked in marketing. She was 31. I saw her photo once from a professional profile and I did not feel what I expected to feel. I felt tired. Just very tired. The apartment in the West Loop was a marital asset. It had been purchased partly with funds from our joint account, which made it subject to division despite the fact that my name was nowhere on the deed. My attorney made sure the court understood that. He hired a lawyer too, eventually. They tried to argue that the LLC payments were a legitimate business expense that lasted about 2 weeks before the documentation made it untenable. The settlement took 4 months. I got the apartment we'd lived in. The one in River North with the windows I'd always loved more than he had. I got my share of the joint accounts plus a portion of the hidden ones because hiding assets in Illinois has consequences. He got his car. He got the investment accounts under his name. He moved into the West Loop apartment, and from what I understand, he's still there. I don't know what happened between him and the woman he'd been seeing. I stopped trying to find out somewhere around month 2 of the divorce process, when I realized that knowing wouldn't change anything that mattered. I kept the apartment. I repainted the bedroom a color I'd always wanted and he'd always vetoed, a deep, warm clay that changes in the afternoon light. I bought new sheets. I ate breakfast at the kitchen counter instead of the table, something he'd always found too casual, and I found that I liked it, that it felt like mine. My sister-in-law, his sister Maureen, texted me a few months after everything was finalized. She said she was sorry. She said she'd had no idea. I believed her. I wrote back and said I knew, and that none of it was her fault. We don't talk anymore, but that conversation helped. My mother came to visit in September. We sat on my balcony, the one I'd never used in winter, and apparently hadn't used much in summer either, and she brought store-bought pie because she said she didn't trust herself to transport a homemade one on the highway. We ate pie on the balcony and she asked how I was really doing, and I thought about it for a moment before I answered. I said I was okay. I said I was okay. I said I was actually okay. She looked at me for a second like she was checking whether I meant it the way mothers do. Then she nodded and took another bite of pie, and we watched the city together. From the 14th floor. What I think about now, when I have the distance to think clearly about it, is not the betrayal itself, though that's there. It doesn't go away entirely. What I think about is the version of myself who stood at that kitchen window watching the sprinklers and thought everything was ordinary. Who let things go unexamined because examining them felt like distrust, and distrust felt like a failing. There's a difference between trusting someone and deciding not to look. I understand now that I had been doing the second thing and calling it the first. He told me once, early in our relationship, that he loved that I was good at my job, that he loved how I could look at something complicated and find the thing that didn't fit. I thought about that a lot in the strange weeks after I first found the hotel charge, when I was still processing everything. He had been watching me find hidden things in other people's lives for 6 years. He must have believed he was different. That I wouldn't look in his direction, that the skills I used at work would stop at our front door. He was wrong about that. I'm not angry at myself for the time it took me to look. I'm not angry at myself for the 20 minutes of crying on the kitchen floor. I'm not angry at myself for making dinner the night he came back from his conference, for sitting beside him on the couch, for needing a few more days before I was ready. Grief doesn't follow a schedule, and neither does clarity. You get it when you get it. What I know now is that I am someone who, when given accurate information, can make a decision. I made mine. It was the right one. The apartment still catches afternoon light in the way it always did, and the clay-colored bedroom is exactly what I wanted, and the sprinklers across the street still go off every Tuesday at 7:15. Some things stay the same. Some things, you realize, were never quite what you thought they were. And that is where the story changes. Not in the hotel charge or the hidden LLC or the discovery process. The story changes in a quiet kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon when you look at a number that doesn't match and decide to trust what you see. I decided to trust what I saw. That's all. That's the whole thing. That's enough. People ask me sometimes whether I regret not catching it sooner, whether I wish I had looked earlier, pushed harder, trusted the quiet unease I'd been carrying around for longer than I want to admit. And I understand why they ask. It seems like an obvious question from the outside. But here's what I've come to understand about that. I wasn't ready sooner. And that matters, not as an excuse, but as a fact about how people actually work. How I actually work. You don't act on something until you have enough of the picture. And the picture was being kept for me deliberately, piece by piece, by someone who knew exactly how I thought. That's not carelessness on my part. That's what deception looks like when it's being done carefully. What I keep coming back to is the moment at my desk. After my mother's phone call, when I had that small, quiet wrongness sitting in my chest, and I had a choice about what to do with it. I could have let it pass. I almost did, Most people do, I think, because following that feeling means accepting that what you find might change everything. And change is terrifying, even when what you're changing out of is something that's already hurting you. I didn't let it pass. I opened the account. I looked, that decision, that single, unglamorous decision to look at a bank statement on a Wednesday evening. That's where the real story is. Not in the hotel charge or the LLC or the settlement, in the decision to trust what I could see over what I'd been told. Integrity, to me, isn't a grand gesture. It's not the confrontation or the legal filing or the strong exit line. It's the accumulation of small, honest choices. It's deciding not to look away from your own life. It's asking the next question even when you're afraid of the answer. My husband made a different kind of accumulation. Small, dishonest choices, one after another, each one making the next one easier. That's how it works in both directions. You practice either honesty or deception, and whichever one you practice becomes the thing you're capable of. I'm not saying I'm without fault in everything. A 7-year marriage is complicated, and I've had enough time now to sit with my part in the distance that had grown between us. But I did not lie. I did not hide money. I did not rent an apartment under a shell company and call it a home services fee. The consequences he faced were the direct result of choices he made, applied steadily over 18 months. That's not punishment, that's just how actions work when you follow them far enough forward. The thing about intelligence. Real intelligence, not just being good at your job, is that it has to be turned inward eventually. I spent 6 years finding hidden things in other people's finances and never once turned that same attention toward my own life. That's the gap I'm working on closing now, not with suspicion, but with honesty. With the willingness to look. I repainted the bedroom. I eat breakfast at the counter now. Small things. But they're mine, and I chose them, and that is more than enough to build on.